welcome to This Explainer. Okay, let's just dive right in, because today we are taking a journey into what is arguably the single deepest mystery of the human body. We're going to explore exactly how a 3-pound, slightly squishy lump of biological tissue inside your skull actually manages to create your mind, your thoughts, and your entire identity. But to really understand this, we're not going to kick things off with some dry, boring anatomy lesson. Instead, I want you to picture the year 1848. We're looking at a railroad worker named Phineas Gage. Now, Gage was a totally normal, well-liked guy, and his job involved tamping gunpowder into blasting holes using this heavy iron rod. But one day, the gunpowder ignites way too early. Boom, a massive explosion. That iron rod shoots like a cannonball right up through his left cheek and completely out the top of his skull. Now, the timeline of what happens next is where this story just gets absolutely wild. You'd think he'd be dead on the spot, right? I mean, obviously. But no. Incredibly, after this iron rod blasts a hole straight through his brain, Phineas just stands up. He literally walks over to a cart, he rides into town totally conscious, and proceeds to explain to a completely disbelieving doctor what just happened. At one point, he even coughed up a piece of his own brain, roughly the size of a teacup, right in front of the poor guy. Physically, against all odds, he survived. But as we're about to see, surviving the physical trauma was really just the beginning of the mystery. And that brings us perfectly to Section 1, the curious case of Phineas Gage. So he heals up physically after a few months, he still has his memories, he can still walk perfectly fine, and he can still talk. But something else was fundamentally broken. You see, before the accident, Gage was known as this affable, soft-spoken guy, a genuinely great person to be around. But after the accident, with this massive gap in his frontal lobe, he became vulgar, mean, and incredibly disagreeable. It's like a switch flipped. His core identity shifted entirely. The change was so drastic that his own friends and coworkers famously summarized his condition with a pretty chilling observation. They simply said he was no longer Gage. And this single freak incident raised an earth-shattering question for the scientific community. How can purely physical damage to a biological organ completely change who someone fundamentally is? To understand how scientists grappled with this, we need to take a quick look at Section 2, the pseudoscience of phrenology. So, let's step back a few decades before Gage's accident, to the early 1800s, just to see what the leading medical minds thought about the brain back then. Enter a German physician named Franz Joseph Gall. Now, Gall spent a lot of time literally just feeling the bumps and divots on the skulls of strangers. He was absolutely convinced that the shape of your skull, the actual physical bumps on your head, revealed your specific personality traits. It was a wildly popular idea at the time, but as you might guess, it was completely fake. Feeling the outside of someone's skull tells you absolutely nothing about the brain working inside. But here's the really fascinating twist. Even with all that pseudoscience, Gall actually stumbled onto one brilliant, enduring truth that forms the entire basis of modern neuroscience. He hit the nail on the head regarding something called localization of function. This is the totally correct idea that different, highly specific parts of your brain manage very specific aspects of your behavior, things like vision, movement, or memory. So sure, Gall was totally wrong about the skull bumps, but he was 100% right about the brain functioning as a collection of specialized regions. Now, before we get into actually mapping out these localized regions of your brain, let's look at Section 3, the 10% myth, just so we can clear up a very persistent misconception. I guarantee you've seen this number everywhere in pop culture. It's the classic myth that we only use 10% of our brains. And honestly, it sounds great, right? Like, if we could just somehow unlock that other 90%, we'd all have superpowers. But think about it for a second. If we only use 10% of our brains, Phineas Gage getting a massive chunk of his blown out wouldn't have been a big deal at all. So the crucial point here is this actual number, 20%. Your brain consumes a massive 20% of your body's total energy every single day. Evolutionary biology simply wouldn't waste that kind of precious energy on an organ if it was mostly just sitting there completely inactive. When we look at modern brain scans, they show that almost all regions of your brain light up just to perform simple, everyday tasks. Make no mistake, you are using the whole shebang.
So if we use all of it, how is it all organized? Let's move to Section 4, the brain as Russian dolls. Honestly, this is absolutely my favorite way to visualize brain anatomy. Think of your brain not as one big single object, but more like a set of nesting dolls built over millions of years of evolution. Complex animals like us didn't just suddenly sprout entirely new brains from scratch. Evolution essentially built newer, more complex systems directly on top of older, simpler ones. So we end up with three main layers: the old brain right at the core, the limbic system wrapped around that, and the cerebral cortex on the very outside. Let's break these down.
The innermost doll is the old brain. You can kind of think of this as our reptilian brain. This layer handles pure automatic survival. It includes the brainstem and medulla, which are busy keeping your heart beating and your lungs breathing without you ever having to consciously think about it. It has the pons coordinating basic movement, the thalamus routing all your incoming sensory data, and this little baseball-sized structure called the cerebellum managing your balance and motor memory. This whole section is basically your body's automatic life support system. Layered right on top of that is the middle doll, the limbic system. This is where things start getting emotional. You've got the amygdala, which drives fear and aggression. Fun fact, if you stimulate an animal's amygdala, a super docile pet can instantly become a completely bloodthirsty creature. Then you have the hypothalamus, managing hunger and acting as your primary reward center. Scientists actually once set up an experiment where they let rats trigger their own hypothalamus for pleasure, and the rats just kept pushing the button until they literally dropped from exhaustion. And finally, in this layer, you have the hippocampus, which is absolutely crucial for forming new memories. All right, moving on to section 5, the lobes and personality. This brings us to the outermost, most advanced doll of our brain, and it's going to lead us right back to the mystery of Phineas Gage. So, the cerebral cortex. This is the wrinkly gray matter you instantly picture when you think of a human brain. It makes up about 80% of the brain's total weight. It's divided into left and right hemispheres that are connected by something called the corpus callosum. And crucially, this massive complex network is supported and nourished by billions of little things called glial cells. Also, just a quick side note here to debunk another persistent pop psychology myth: you are not left-brained or right-brained when it comes to your personality. It's true that some specific functions are localized, but both sides of your brain are deeply and constantly communicating. They work together on basically everything. Now, the cortex itself is divided into 4 main lobes. The occipital lobe in the back handles your sight. The parietal lobe up top processes touch. The temporal lobe on the sides manages sound and speech comprehension. But the absolutely crucial one for our story today is the frontal lobe. This sits right behind your forehead. It oversees planning, complex speech, judgment, and, most importantly for us, your personality. Within these lobes, you have some incredibly specialized regions. For example, if I were to somehow lightly shock your motor cortex, your arm would physically twitch completely involuntarily. But spread across all 4 lobes are also these things called association areas. You can't just poke them and get a twitch. These are the areas doing the real heavy lifting of human consciousness, interpreting complex data, engaging in subtle thinking, integrating memories, and basically making you, you. And that brings us perfectly to section 6, biology and psychology linked. Let's connect all of this cool anatomy straight back to our explosive opening story. This, right here, is the key to the whole mystery. Phineas Gage didn't change because he was cursed, and he wasn't just acting out because he was psychologically traumatized by the event. It was purely mechanical. That iron rod physically destroyed a massive portion of his frontal lobes. By obliterating that specific biological tissue, the rod literally severed his mechanical capacity to process judgment, to regulate his emotions, and to maintain his original personality. And this brilliantly illustrates a profound phrase you'll often hear neuroscientists use: the mind is what the brain does. Every single thought you have, every emotion you feel, every joke you laugh at, and every decision you make, it's all deeply and inextricably tethered to the biological health of the physical tissue inside your skull. So I want to leave you with this final kind of provocative thought. If a purely physical injury, just a piece of flying iron, can instantly and permanently change who you fundamentally are, well, how much of your personality is truly you as an independent soul or spirit, and how much of it is just the result of some very fragile biology?